Hi there, and welcome to the FanUni University's Lizzie Bennett Diaries, Lecture 3, this time about the history of Jane Austen fandom. Natalie Tyler, in her fun and informative book, The Friendly Jane Austen, says that there are 4 types of Jane Austen fans: Janeites, gentle Jane fans, fans of the ironic Jane, and subversive Jane fans. Janeites are interested in the romance and the fun and think that Jane Austen is just the best example of one of these kinds of authors. Gentle Jane fans view Jane Austen as a brilliant moralist. Ironic Jane fans find her wit, humor, and biting commentary on society the most interesting thing about Jane Austen. And subversive Jane fans, of course, find her upturning of societal ideals and irreverence towards the sacred cows of her culture the most refreshing and interesting part of her novels. I myself am a gentle Jane fan. I find her moral observations and growth in her characters the most powerful and moving things about her novels. Although, like most Jane Austen fans, I also love the romance, enjoy the humor, and find the challenging of certain ideas very refreshing. But if I had to pick, I would be a gentle Jane fan. Claire Harmon, in her book Jane's Fame, How Jane Austen Conquered the World, notes that there were 2 major waves of Jane Austen popularity. The first was in the late 1800s during the High Victorian era, and the second was in 1995 when the film and television adaptations took Jane Austen's popularity to new heights. Jane Austen lived from 1775 to 1817. She was one of 7 children, 6 brothers and 1 sister. She was the younger sister and a middle child, although fortunately for us, she never had out-of-wedlock pregnancy or any irresolution. She wrote 6 novels, Pride and Prejudice being the most famous, but she started with Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion, although interestingly, Sense and Sensibility was the first one published in 1811, while Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published in 1818 after she died. The first 3 novels, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice, all were drafted in the 1790s, even though they were published in the 1810s. Though she was a modest success in her lifetime and made a fair amount of money, she was never a runaway bestseller. Instead, she was more admired by a select few, including the Prince Regent of England and Sir Walter Scott, author of Ivanhoe. She was primarily renowned as a realist, someone who disapproved of too much emotion and romance, and instead was very rational and described the minute details of everyday life. She had a few male fans throughout the middle of the 1800s, but notably a lot of female authors seemed to dislike her, particularly Charlotte Bronte, who thought she was really boring, a fact for which I have a difficult time forgiving Charlotte Bronte. She also attracted the attention of the growing cult of domesticity in the late part of the 1800s, and so she had her first surge to huge popularity as part of this movement, and her novels became illustrated and popular editions, and you had illustrations like these, where the characters lose their specific place in Regency England and sort of have an amalgamation of Victorian and Regency dress. This popularity crested probably around World War I, when Rudyard Kipling wrote a story called Janeites, coining the term, and explaining how Jane Austen helped soldiers in the trenches get through the horrors of World War I. From the 50s to the 70s, the study of Jane Austen both as an ironist, the ironic Jane school, and as a historical author interested in the context of her characters rose to prominence, which was upended in the 80s when feminism took over the Academy and people began to be interested not just in how irony and historical context affected the aesthetics of Jane Austen, but also the gender and politics of her characters and how that could speak to our own situation today. In the 80s, we also had the first major popular version of Jane Austen in the first BBC miniseries starring Elizabeth Garvey and David Rintoul. It still has a devoted but small fan base today. 1995 to 1996 surge of Jane Austen film adaptations, including the insanely popular Pride and Prejudice, adapted by Andrew Davies and starring Colin Firth and Jennifer Ehle. These films sort of highlighted the postmodern way that Jane Austen has affected our culture and packaged all the humor and romance for a popular audience. It sort of dribbled out in the late 90s, but came back in the 2000s, starting in 2005, when Joe Wright's Pride and Prejudice, starring Keira Knightley and Matthew Macfadyen, started off a stream of adaptations that ended up in all 6 of her major novels being adapted for film or television. Some of them better than others. That brings us to today, when we have currently the longest running Pride and Prejudice adaptation in the Lizzie Bennet Diaries that is airing as we come to the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's publication of Pride and Prejudice in 1813. I'll sort of highlight the 2 phases of popularity. The late 1800s, during the High Victorian era, when she was embraced by the cult of domesticity for the romance part of the Janeite, or even the Gentle Jane school of criticism, and then the mid-1990s, when she became a popular, sexy author who had the right amount of romance, but also comfort and fine houses and lifestyles that we enjoyed. So both of the surges in popularity, I think, rode on the Janeite sort of lens, even though there are these other 3, the Gentle Jane moralists, the ironic Jane humorists, and the subversive Jane challengers. So, as your assignment for this week, I would ask you, which kind of Jane Austen fan are you, and why? Have a great week.